Welcome and thank you for coming to the I Value Hampton budget website so that you can participate in our I Value polling. I am so glad to have you come to our site and learn more about the Hampton budget process. For those of you who do not know me, I'm Mary Bunting and I have the honor and privilege of serving as your city manager. I really take this job as a special privilege because I grew up in this community, and it's a treasure to get to give back to the place that made me who I am each and every day. Hampton is one of the few localities in the country that actually gives residents the chance to weigh in on the budget before the city manager makes a proposal to the city council on how they should consider spending the tax dollars for the community betterment each and every year. And that's what we're doing right now. I have not yet made a budget recommendation, and so we're asking you to give us your thoughts through preference polling that you will do today after you watch a series of videos about each of the choices before the community. What we're doing right now is giving you a little snapshot or context as to some of the issues that we're facing. And after watching these quick videos, you will be asked for your preferences. So thank you for investing the time to learn more about your city and for sharing your viewpoints. First up, we will give you a sense of where the revenue comes from and the programs that your taxes support. And then we will ask again for your opinions. The budget is very important because it basically lays the groundwork for all city services and programs. The City Council is the final decision maker on the allocation of funds to the various city departments and the services they provide, but the city manager is responsible for making recommendations as to how to achieve service delivery and the goals that are articulated by the community in the strategic plan, community plan, and master plans. Where does the money go? In this chart, you will see that the percentages of where money goes. And so think about this as where each dollar we collect gets allocated. So here, for instance, you see that education gets 44.9% of every dollar. So think of it as about 45 cents of every dollar goes to our school system. And then public safety gets 10.3% or 10 cents on every dollar, and so forth and so on. So you can see that the bulk of our money is going to education and public safety. Now, in terms of the allocation to our city schools, the council and school board years ago agreed on a fair share funding formula so the schools could reasonably plan for their budget. This developed out of a time when the school system actually asked for an increase that far exceeded all of the local revenue growth. And the council articulated to the school board that, of course, it also needed money for things like police and fire. So they really worked together, rolled up their sleeves to look at all of the revenues and say, what is a fair share allocation for our schools? Because, of course, we value education for our young people and want to support our teachers, but we also want to support, as I mentioned, police and firefighters and librarians and our garbage collectors and all the other city employees as well. So back then, and this formula has held ever since, the agreement was to give 61.83% of all of our residential revenues. So that includes real estate, personal property, and residential utility taxes. So that comes off the top of our revenue growth. Then city operations get the remainder of roughly 35, 36%, and then all of the commercial taxes. I do want to note, though, that we typically think of the state giving quite a bit of money to the schools, and they do, but they don't give nearly enough, as represented by the fact that every locality in Virginia far exceeds the state match allocation for schools. In our case, we are giving more than 73% of what our state match requirement is. And that's because they have artificially low standards of quality funding for our schools. And you might say, well, what about all those lottery proceeds? Aren't they supposed to be going to the schools? Well, they are legally going to the schools, but what the State General Assembly does is they give the lottery money to the schools and then they reduce their other funding for the schools in exchange, unfortunately. Now, to understand what we spend money on, you need to understand what the expenses are comprised of. And I want to note that on the city side of things, personnel services is over half of our budget. About 55% of our costs are our personnel. And on the school side, it's about 90%. And so what this means is, as an employer, if we are going to give our workforce a cost of living increase, and let's say that happens to be 3%, then we need to have revenue growth that will accommodate that. So you probably hope that your employer, or if you're on fixed income like Social Security, that the federal government is giving you a cost of living increase. Our employees expect that from us as well. So we try to plan for a minimum of a cost of living increase. When our salaries fall behind the market, we need to plan for even more, which had happened over the last couple of years. Fortunately, we've been able to catch up over the last couple of years, and you'll see in a moment that our public safety salaries are now at the top of the region, which we're very proud of because we really value our public safety personnel. I'm going to show you a few benchmark comparisons so that you can judge for yourselves how we're doing in terms of our manning and in terms of our tax rates. Right here you see Hampton in comparison to other cities, large cities in our region. Of course, there are other cities like Pocosa and Williamsburg, but they're considerably smaller. Hampton is on the mid to lower range of population, but we're on the upper end of residents served per employee, meaning that our manning is much lower than other cities. And here you see how many residents per general fund employee we serve. General fund, by the way, is a fancy way of saying the bulk of our city departments. This would include the ones that you typically think of: libraries, parks and recreation, police, fire, many of the public works departments. And if you take out public safety, because this is where we've been adding most positions in the last few years, we're actually the lowest. You can see that the median for the Hampton Roads large cities is 81.91 employees, residents per employee served, but Hampton is at 110. And I use this as a measure to show that we're not bloated in terms of our number of employees per capita. We actually are very thinly manned, meaning it's very hard to cut more without compromising city service delivery. And it also is a reason why I think it's very, very important that we reward our hardworking employees because they are working ostensibly much harder than some of these other cities that have much lower ratios of residents served per employee. Now, if we talk about how we get our revenue to provide services, you'll see that the bulk of it comes from locally generated revenue. And while we get 14% of our revenue from the state, almost all of it is for restricted functions. And by this, I mean the money that comes from the state is already pre-allocated. So for instance, the state gives us revenue for social service employees, but that must be used for those employees. We can't allocate that and say, well, we'll cut social services and use that money instead for police and fire folks, as an example, or for the library. We must use that for social services. They also give us money for jail operations, or they give us money for our constitutional offices. They give us money for street resurfacing. So there are things that we must use it for. Most of our flexible money to spend at our local discretion is really the locally generated revenue. You will see that there's a very small percentage of federal revenue, and that largely comes to us via grants. And I am going to talk about that a little bit later because I'm sure you've heard some of the conversation that's now occurring at the federal level about pauses in federal grants. And in fact, one of the things we're going to poll you on a little bit later is on your thoughts about these federal grants. Should they go away? Do you want us to pick them up or not? So keep that on pause for just a moment, but we will be asking you about that. I do want to talk about some state impacts to the budget because not only do they provide some restricted revenues for us to use, but they do require us to pick up some cost, and they don't provide the funding for that. The biggest one of those currently is what we call disabled veteran tax relief. And I want to stipulate that the things I'm about to talk about are all very worthy, and I'm not commenting about their importance at all, but rather the fact that the state requires it and doesn't offset the cost of it. So you may recall that many years ago, we were given a chance as voters on a referendum to decide whether or not we thought that 100% service-connected disability should be a qualification for 100% property tax relief. And overwhelmingly, that measure passed. And for good reason. People who have served our country, defended it, and given us freedom, and have suffered 100% disability should be provided a measure of thanks from us as voters and taxpayers. However, because we're a very military-friendly community, we have been disproportionately impacted with the number of veterans who qualify for that relief. And you can see on this chart that that relief started at 2.1 million, but has grown this year to 10.3 million. And just to put that in context, 10.3 million is equivalent to 6.5 cents on our real estate tax rate. Now, our real estate tax rate is currently $1.15. If the state had never put that mandate in place, or if they were covering the cost of that mandate, our tax rate could be more like $1.09. So because Hampton is a military-friendly community with a VA hospital, several military bases in our area, people come to our area, they love the quality of life, they choose to locate here when they retire, then they qualify for this benefit. We have more impact than many other localities in the region or in the state. And so we are underwriting a bill for more impact, meaning we must carry a higher tax rate just to be able to afford that. So this year, when our assessments came out and the assessments grew, we immediately had to take $2 million off the table before we ever got started. $2 million that could have gone to tax relief for everyone that can't go to tax relief for everyone because it has to go first to disabled tax relief for 100% service-connected veterans. Again, I do not begrudge them that tax relief, but I'm explaining to you all why that relief is not available to all of you. That is a first in requirement because of the state unfunded mandate. I'm not going to talk about all of these. You certainly are able to read these for yourself. But the other one I want to touch on is the Dillon Rule, because many people have never heard of this. The Dillon Rule applies to Virginia and a handful of other states across the country, but most states are what would be called home rule. And it's important that you understand this distinction, because many times residents come to us with really good ideas. They might say, well, why don't you raise the sales tax and lower the real estate tax so that more people, like out-of-town visitors, can contribute to our services as opposed to only residents contributing to our services. And that might be a worthy idea. We had a resident come to council and say, why don't you have a different tax rate for commercial properties than residential properties? And again, that may be a meritorious idea. But in Virginia, you can't do those things without going to the General Assembly and getting permission because of the Dillon Rule. The Dillon Rule only allows cities, towns, and counties in Virginia to do expressly what is permitted by your charter or by state code. This contrasts with home rule states, which many of you may have lived in before you came to Hampton, which allows cities to do anything that is not expressly prohibited. And if you're a parent, you really know the difference, because you know how creative children can get in their definitions of what, if you say you can't do this, they might do it anyway and say, well, that's not this, it's that. So it's really important to understand that your council is not being difficult when they say they can't do something. It's because it may not be authorized in our charter or our code. Now, I mentioned that most of our money comes from the local taxes and local revenues, and there are 5 big ones that basically will tell us whether we're going to have growth sufficient to do salary increases for our workforce or new services that you might be asking us to provide. And those big 5 are real estate, personal property, meals, sales, and business license. Now, there are a lot of other things like court fines and other fees, and they all matter because they make up together 20% of the budget. One of the ones we get asked about a lot is the motor vehicle license fee. Well, why do you have to charge that if we don't have a decal on our car anymore? And if you all want a decal, we can certainly give you a decal, but we're not required to have a decal, and so people never like putting it on their car and taking it off. But if we were to get rid of that, we would have to cut millions of dollars out of our budget or make up for millions of dollars. Cutting millions of dollars out is very difficult because, as you saw, we're already very thinly manned. So the council of this city and almost every city in Virginia has continued to collect it because it's just very impractical to make up all of that money. So I'm going to talk about these real quickly, especially the real estate since it's the largest. It is, as I mentioned, the single largest source of revenue, almost half of it, of the local revenue that we get. And the only way this is going to increase is with new construction, which of course is the best because it means new people are paying revenue to the city, and that means it's not coming from our existing taxpayers. And so this happens when vacant land is redeveloped or a vacant building is redeveloped. That's that second bullet, an improvement made either to a vacant property or if someone is adding on to their home. And we hope to stimulate that. We try to get vacant properties developed, and we've had a lot of new development in recent years, and that has helped us. But we also are legally required by the state to do reassessments and to reflect changes in market value. And I want to talk a little bit about reassessment because there seems to be a myth out there, and not just in Hampton, but across the Commonwealth. I talk to my other city manager peers, and they hear this myth too, that cities just somehow decide how much money they want, and they tell their assessor to come up with that amount of money. That is absolutely not how it works. Assessment is a very regulated and technical process that involves looking at market sales values. And those sales values must be verified. They must be arm's length transactions. In other words, they don't look at foreclosures. They don't look at sales between family members. They look at true market sales. And those sales are applied to the appropriate neighborhoods, and then assessments are made to appropriate comparable properties. And we must do that and try to be as close to 100% value as possible. In fact, if we don't do that, the state can come in and take over our assessment process. So what happens is those assessments are applied across the city, and they have to reflect each neighborhood. So neighborhoods' market values do not move uniformly. Waterfront properties may move very differently than interior community properties. Bigger homes may move differently than smaller homes. You may have historic properties move differently than newer properties. So what you see us report to you on your postcards that you get is your assessment value change. You also now get, because of a state law change, a report of what the average is in the city. And that average reflects the calculation of everyone's property changes. And so that average is reflecting, everyone's property. So there's some that are very high and some that are very low, and then some that didn't change at all, and then what is the average there. And the state tells us to tell you what the equalized rate would be if they allowed for 1% inflationary growth. And this year, that rate was 111. So you'll see in a moment, I'm going to talk about the policy that council adopted, which would allow for cost of living growth. And that calculation would be $1.14. So that's just a point of information for you, but reassessments are legally required. And then the other way that we could get growth in this revenue is to do a tax increase. But we have not done that since 2014, and we only did that in 2014 because reassessments were actually continually going down. So we try to avoid that one at all cost. I'm not going to go through all of these charts. You can certainly go through them at your leisure. These are just points of information for you about how commercial, multifamily, and residential rates have changed. And you can also see historically how our overall property values have changed. But please note, when we are showing you this includes residential, multifamily, and commercial. I also want to show you comparisons, and this is over time. It's not just this year, but it shows you how other cities have changed, because I think people think that what we're experiencing is unique to Hampton. It certainly isn't. You can see how other cities have changed. And by the way, we'll talk more about this as we go on, but Hampton has lowered its tax rate 9 cents in the last several years. And other cities have not been as aggressive as we have been in lowering our tax rate, even though, as you can see, they have had more assessed value increases than we have had. Now, this is where we currently stand with regard to our tax rate. And you can see that Hampton is towards the lower end, with Norfolk, Portsmouth, and Newport News being higher than us, and Suffolk, Chesapeake, and Virginia Beach being lower than us. I will note, because Newport News is our next door neighbor, they have two things we don't have that contribute very significantly to their tax base. They have waterworks and the shipyard. And each year we look at what waterworks and the shipyard are contributing to the Newport News General Fund, or their major city departments. Waterworks, by the way, gives Newport News over $9 million each year on what's called a return on equity. It's basically a transfer to their general fund. And depending upon the year, it's varied anywhere between like 22 cents and 40 cents contribution, which means we start out behind on our tax rate because they have a 22 to 40 cent advantage over us, and we still end up lower than them. And we're offering basically the same complement of services. So I think that's another measure of how efficient we are being with your tax dollars. But as I turn to our housing values, you're going to see something very starkly different about Suffolk, Chesapeake, and Virginia Beach, and why they're able to have a much lower rate, although we're catching up, than we have. And it's illustrated here. They have higher housing values than we do. So even though they have lower rates, their homeowners are paying more in taxes, which means you could live in Chesapeake, Virginia Beach, and Suffolk and have a lower tax rate, but you'd still be paying a higher tax bill. And that's because their median value, their median incomes, and their housing values are substantially higher. Look at this chart here. Suffolk, Virginia Beach, and Chesapeake all have incomes, median family incomes, that are roughly at least $25,000 higher than ours. I'm not going to talk about all of these except to say that personal property is usually relatively flat unless there are very strange things going on in the economy, like during COVID when the supply chain was not producing new cars, so there was undue pressure on used car market. But usually this is pretty flat, which means you can't rely on it to produce income growth for us to give a salary increase to our employees or to provide new services for our community. And meals tax and sales tax, we have been able to rely on pretty regularly to provide a little bit of income growth, but I'm very worried about these this year because of all the things going on with federal workforce. When employees in the federal workforce, which we have quite a bit of with NASA, Langley, the VA, and all of the contractors that work for them, are worried about whether they're going to have jobs or not, it's very natural for them to pull back on their spending in our economy because they don't know whether they're going to continue to have their employment or not. And so they stop spending. So these go down. And then what happens is you get secondary and tertiary effects, because if they're not eating at restaurants or buying in the stores, then those store owners and restaurateurs, they don't get as much money, so they may have to lay off some of their folks. So all of the localities in our region are very worried that these numbers are going to go down. Now we don't know because all of us are sort of living in real time what's going on and what the ultimate resolution to some of these issues is going to be. We may not know before we have to adopt a budget. So I honestly don't know what we're going to do yet. I suspect what my strategy will be is to put a conservative number for meals and sales tax, but not really cut it because if I cut it too much and I overcut it, I can't increase the revenues once we get into the budget. But what we may do is put the numbers there and then hold spending until these issues really settle out. Because We know that there is going to be a bit of time of turbulence in these numbers, but we don't know how long that's going to be. So these are very volatile to consumer confidence, and consumer confidence is clearly shaken right now. And of course, you have the whole tariff issue that needs to also settle out. And then business license is a tax that businesses pay on their gross receipts. It's really important that we maintain structural balance, and by that I mean, unlike the federal government, we do maintain a balanced budget. And that is, we make sure that the recurring revenues, that's money spent to cover everyday expenses like salaries, gas, office expenses, rent, things that come in every year, we cover with revenue that comes in every year, and we don't overspend the budget. Now, it's impossible, literally impossible for us to end a year exactly on the dot. And that's because there are lots of factors, some of which I just discussed, others of which might include we don't know how many winter storms or other weather events like hurricanes or nor'easters or tropical storms we might get. We don't know all sorts of things that might happen in a given year, like how many vacant positions we may end up with because of military spouse relocations or retirements and things like that. We make our best educated guess because we don't want to budget more than we need, so we'll make what's called an attrition estimate for vacancy salary savings, but you can't be perfect on any of those things. And we're not going to overspend unless something catastrophic happens at the very end of the fiscal year. So we're going to end up in a surplus position every year. But that surplus cannot be spent on recurring things because you're never going to end up in exactly the same place at the end of the year every year, because those things that actually generate a surplus don't happen the same way every year. So what we do is we use any surplus for one-time expenses, and we also use one-time revenues that we might get. And most of the one-time revenues are those kinds of things I just described for capital improvements. And when you get to your polling in just a few moments, you're going to be asked to give us your preferences on recurring expenses, which would align with the recurring revenues. And those recurring revenues are those things I just described to you: real estate, personal property, meals, sales, business license, and the like. And the capital expenses are those one-time revenues, like surpluses at the end of the year, and bonds, which are like going to the bond market, which I'll talk about in just a quick second. This is a summary of our budget and what it has been since 2014. The budget is the dark blue line, the total budget for the city. Inflation adjustments, had we done inflation adjustments, is the teal or light blue line. And you can see that in every year, the total budget has not, and I say that again, has not kept up with total inflation adjustments. Again, a signal that we are trying to spend your money very judiciously and not just arbitrarily keeping up with inflation. And so I mentioned bonds just a moment ago as a one-time source of revenue. And I mentioned, this is kind of equivalent to your mortgage. So what I mean by that is when you go to buy a home, you don't pay cash all up front. It's not practical or feasible for you. You get a mortgage and you pay it off over 15 or 30 years with level payments over time. The city does the same thing with its bonds. So we go to the bond market every year or every other year, and we have level payments too. They're called debt service. And prior councils and the current council have determined what level of debt service payment we're willing to make. And that is no more than 10% of the city budget. And you can see right now we're at 7.7%. So we're well under that policy threshold. So we're spending roughly 7.7 cents of every dollar that we take in to fund capital projects. And the way we do this is we time, because we're paying off every year, and so we don't borrow more than we pay off in any given year. So when you look at those capital projects in a few moments and you poll on your preferences, please know we're looking to see what your top preferences are. We don't intend to do any more projects than our debt service policy would allow us to do. There is absolutely no intention to do all of those projects. Those are just all the projects that have been suggested by various members of the community or departments or constituents, in the community. So we're looking to see which ones rise to the top. And we would slot them in various years in the next 5 years of our capital improvement plan. But our intention is to stay in our debt service policy and not exceed the 7.7%, so that we don't put undue pressure on the tax rates or on our budget. And I just want to begin to summarize by saying that we want to continue to grow our economy and our tax base by doing various things that grow our tax base in ways that other people help to pay for city service delivery. And these are just a few of the ways that we have done so over time and that we will continue to do so. I touched on this earlier. It's just a reminder that as we do tax relief, for good reason, again, the disabled veteran one is a very good reason, we are taking away revenue that otherwise could be used for things like tax relief, so we must replace them with other sources of revenue. These are a summary of the budget challenges I'm going to have to deal with as I make a recommended budget to council, and that I ask you to think about as you do your polling that is coming up. So the first poll we're going to ask you to do is dealing with our real estate tax and where you'd like to see it be. I know this is a big one for all of us. I want to start by summarizing the council adopted real estate tax rate stabilization policy. Many years ago, this was about the time when Mayor Ross Carney was mayor, and several council members, Randy Gilliland, Charlie Sapp, Angela Leary, Rhett Tigner, I'm not remembering all of them, so I apologize, but they were on council, and they felt like it was really important to establish a guideline or a policy for how much real estate revenue in reassessment times, or growth of reassessment rather, should be able to grow. And they did a lot of studying, and they decided that real estate revenue should be capped. They also understood, as we've been talking about, that it needed to grow somewhat to be able to give employees a salary increase, because they wanted to be a good employer and allow at least for a cost of living raise. So this is the policy they came up with, and we have adhered to for the most part, and I'll explain the only deviations we've made in just a second. But the policy reads that the growth net of new construction, meaning new people, they don't hurt the rest of us. So net of new construction from 1 year to next shall be limited to the equivalent percentage increase in an inflationary growth factor that's measured either by Consumer Price Index for urban dwellers, CPIU, or resident income growth, whichever is greater in any given year. And again, they picked these two because they figured that our employees should get either Consumer Price Index growth or resident income growth, because we wanted to give the employees what residents were getting. And the residents would either get, what their employers were giving them and or what Social Security was giving seniors on a fixed income. And that we would use those as the barometer for how much real estate revenue should be allowed to grow. They then went on to say if there was a certain need that we could not anticipate, maybe there was some state mandate that we were going to be required to do, then that made real estate revenue grow faster than that, the manager and council would explicitly explain that to the public. And there were 2 times where that was done. One time was when school construction was needed, and the other time was when major changes to public safety were required. And then they suggested that we do what we've been doing, try to diversify our revenues so that we didn't have to rely on real property revenues during economic declines. They also created a council finance committee that had 2 council members and several citizens that actually are charged with reviewing this tax rate equalization policy every year. And they have done so every year, and will do so this year. The finance director actually does the calculations, which are pretty complicated, but we have expert citizens on the panel, and they review his calculations and report to council each year, and they will do so during the formal budget hearing processes later this spring. So here you see the actual formal council-approved tax equalization charts for the past several years, including this upcoming year. This one has not been approved by council yet. It has not been approved by the Council Finance Committee yet. They will meet in a couple of weeks. But the finance director has calculated it for me so that I could show it to you all in these conversations. And what you will find is that in each of the years to date, the council adopted actual tax rate has been less than the calculated equalized tax rate. So for instance, in the current fiscal year 2025, the equalized tax rate was $1.17, and the council adopted a tax rate of $1.15. The equalized tax rate this year would be $1.14, and that's because my understanding from the finance director is the equalized tax rate allows for a 3% adjustment in that factor of CPIU. And so allowing for that 3% factor adjustment would produce a tax rate of $1.14. You may remember I mentioned earlier that the state required formula on your postcard, assessment postcard, had a rate of $1.11. That's because the state formula requires a calculation of a 1% inflationary factor. So because the state had that as a factor, and the council adopted policy has a CPIU, a resident income factor, which was 3% this year, we have shown as options for you here what the revenue produces at $1.11 to $1.15, and how much we lose in each of the calculations as you go down to those different rates. What's most important here is how much revenue we would get to use for either employee salary increases or other city services of a recurring nature at each scenario. Now, I'm just going to use $1.11 because that's the lowest one up here. At $1.11, there would be $2 million available. But the city would not get all that $2 million because you may remember I said earlier that the school funding formula requires that 61.83% goes to the schools. So this next chart shows you at different distribution levels what would go to the city and what would go to the schools. Now on this chart, because a councilwoman asked for it, we went down from all the way to $1.08, and I'm sharing that with all of you as well. We had the request because some citizens had asked specifically for $1.08, so we did this calculation. And you could see that really at $1.10, the city actually loses money and the schools get more. And the reason for this is because residential assessments went up higher than commercial assessments and multifamily this year. Commercial and multifamily are done on an income-based approach, and they went up more last year, and so they're starting to slow this year. Residential is starting to slow as well, but not quite as much. So what you see here is that because the city relies more on commercial growth and the schools rely more on residential growth, they actually get more. So they don't lose quite as fast as the city does. So under some of these scenarios, the city could not even provide a salary increase for its employees. Now, with this information in mind, we're going to move to the polling question and ask you, what is your preferred real estate tax rate? Our next question comes from information the judges provided to us. They let us know that the courthouse security fee could be raised, that in 2020 the General Assembly amended the Virginia Code to allow the courthouse security fee to be raised from $10, which is where we currently have it, to $20. This fee would be only imposed on individuals convicted of violating a statute or ordinance. To implement the fee, the localities must pass an ordinance specifying the amount for each court. So this would be for General District, Circuit Court, and Juvenile and Domestic Relations Court. It must be used to fund security personnel, and if requested by the sheriff to whom funds are appropriated. It can also cover equipment and other security-related personal property for the sheriff. We estimate that if we were to do this, we could get $53,655 more for a $15 fee, or $107,310 more for a $20 fee. And this revenue could strengthen courthouse security without having to come from your general tax dollars. Please let us know if you would prefer to keep the fee as is or to increase it by $5 or $10. Now we'll talk about our wastewater fee history. You may recall, because we talked about this last year, that all cities in our area are subject to a consent decree from the EPA and DEQ. And this relates because we have very aged infrastructure in our area. And we are working to address pipes that have water seeping into them and then getting into the Chesapeake Bay. Originally, HRSD had planned to deal with this, and that is why you can see that for a very long time, Hampton did not increase its wastewater fee. We were assuming that HRSD was going to do the work as they had indicated they were going to do. But then we were notified a couple of years ago that they were not going to do the work, and so we had to, if you will, make up for lost time in a pretty significant way so that we could meet the DEQ and EPA mandates in time. And this is an example of what we're discussing needs to be done. On the left-hand side, you see how water is getting into the sewer pipes, and you can see after rehab how much better the condition is. So this is the chart we showed you last year. We did increase this last year, and unfortunately we're going to have to increase it for the next several years, although the increases will get much more minor. I had asked the staff before if we could moderate this so it didn't have to be as much at one time, and unfortunately, because we need to get a lot of work done by fiscal 2030, we really can't moderate it without endangering penalties from DEQ and EPA. By the way, the penalties run $32,500 per day. So we would end up actually much more expensive if we don't do this. Now, I'm showing you on this chart where we were in 25 after we increased the fee, and you can see that we were at 24, very, very low. In 25, we actually were in the middle because other cities moved their rates as well. And we're projecting at 26 we'd be high, but I expect other cities to move their rates again as they did this year. This is, again, the schedule of our recommendations, and we're now going to ask you for your preferences. I do want to note that our recommendation is to continue as we've recommended, merely because we do face penalties if we do not, but certainly we have the option of not doing it and risking the DEQ penalties. Or always we have an option of being more aggressive, although I know money's tight for everyone, and I wouldn't expect us to try to move more aggressively than we legally need to do so. And now we're going to poll on our stormwater management fees. Stormwater management fee was and is a federal and state mandate to improve the quality of our stormwater. And that is important because we want to have clean water, but frankly, in our area, we're also equally, in fact, more concerned about the quantity of stormwater. And so what we try to do in Hampton is to combine water quantity with water quality projects to improve both. And we have used stormwater fees to do this, and our policy has been over time to increase the stormwater fee by $1 per ERU, or equivalent residential unit, each year, alternating between capital cost and maintenance cost each year. And this allows us to make improvements to both quality and quantity in equal measure. For residents, this means your annual bill would go up by $12, and it's typically collected by your mortgage company, and I mean by $12 for a year. Businesses pay more because the ERU is the impervious area on their property, so big asphalt users pay more. This is the Hampton bill in comparison to others. We did not raise it last year because we had quite a bit of state and federal grants. I had actually planned not to ask for an increase this year because we had a large $20 million grant from the EPA, but given things in Washington, we believe this grant is likely to go away. And therefore, if we want to keep up with our flood mitigation efforts, I do believe we will now need this money. So please let us know if you would like to proceed with the dollar increase for Resilient Hampton flood mitigation projects, or you would prefer not to do that, or you would prefer to be more aggressive. On solid waste, the good news is we do not need an increase this year, but I do want to forecast we will need them in future years as costs are increasing. NASA steam plant agreement. NASA doesn't pay as much as they used to for this steam plant. For those of you who don't know what the steam plant is, we take all of your residential waste there, we burn it, it generates steam for NASA that powers NASA, and your waste is reduced by 90%. The remaining 10% goes to the landfill and preserves the life of our landfill. It's a very innovative project. We've been doing that. We were actually one of the first waste-to-energy steam plants in the country, but we do need to begin to replace things like boilers at the steam plant. So we have some costs going up. Also, recycling costs are going up. We did increase the fee last year, and as I said, no fee increases required this year. These are some of the costs that we have coming up. So that's why I say we will have cost in the future, but not this year. And this is the projected fees that we may be facing in the future. Now, I will say we are at the top of the region currently, but that's because we have some things that other cities do not currently have. The biggest one of which is weekly bulk trash pickup. Bulk trash is like your couches, your refrigerators, other large items that don't fit into toters. We are the only city in the region that does that on a weekly basis. I know that's something that our residents really like. We ask each year if that's something you're willing to forego, and we're going to ask that in just a second because that is something that could save money if you want to save money there. Each year, residents have strongly said they want to keep that. But I ask it every year in case you would like to save money. A lot of cities are also moving away from curbside recycling. We haven't because to meet the state curbside recycling mandate, we need to keep it unless we're able to count our waste to energy conversion at the steam plant. So one of the questions you're going to have in just a second is if you are willing to support getting rid of curbside recycling, if we can get legislative approval at the General Assembly to count that. So anyway, these are the questions that we have for you. Would you like to switch bulk collection to save money? If we went to every other week, it would save 25 cents. If we went to monthly, it would save 35 cents. And eliminating curbside recycling could lower fees by up to 47 cents per week. Now we want to talk a little bit about staff compensation and get your viewpoints on that. I want to first share our compensation philosophy with you. Historically, Hampton has tried to make sure we are at least in the middle of the region of those cities we've been talking about. Honestly, we prefer to be in the upper middle, predominantly because, as we've been talking about, our employees are carrying a greater load than the employees in other cities with that higher residents per employee manning level that we were looking at earlier in our conversation. So our goals are to provide competitive wage increases and to review and update our pay scales, in particular for hard to fill positions, but to also make sure that we are keeping pace with the market and addressing compression. And in case you don't know what compression is, that's something that occurs when you move the start of a pay range, but you don't move your existing employees by the same amount. And that happened during like the recession and other times where we had to move the start of a pay range, like for police and fire folks, just to be able to get new hires. But maybe we moved them, moved the ranges up by 5%, but we were only able to give a 2 or a 3% raise for our existing workers. And so the new officer got very close to the existing officer, and therefore we weren't really recognizing the tenure and length of service of our very talented public safety team. So we needed to fix that. And we also, of course, want to recognize our high performers with monetary and non-monetary awards. Now, we've moved away from doing merit pay. We predominantly do this through one-time bonuses. Now, I mentioned we had compression in our police and fire, and we also wanted to make sure that we were attracting talent to our police and fire ranks, and so we made some major adjustments over the last couple of years. And you'll see that our efforts have paid off. Hampton was closer to the bottom, and now we're pretty close to the top, as you can see. This happens to show where recruits are after they complete the academy across all localities. And one thing you will see that is pretty surprising, actually, is that Virginia Beach is now at the lowest. And you may be seeing talk in the media, if you follow regional news, that Virginia Beach is planning to address that this fiscal year. But what we did is, in addition to moving our starting salaries up, we made sure we eliminated compression, like I was just talking about, by creating a step plan. And so each of our officers now is guaranteed a 2.5% step increase for every year of service up to year 10. and then after year 10, a 2.5% adjustment every other year. And that's what other cities that have gone to a step system to deal with their compression have done. And so we're very competitive. I believe our police and fire team are satisfied with that step plan. At least that's what they have expressed to me and their chiefs. And we have every intention of continuing that. So what we would be recommending for them this year is that their step increase would go into effect in January. That's how the step plans have been working, not only here, but in other cities like Chesapeake that we emulated when we went to this plan. The cost of that for a full year is $1.1 million. We also review the market each December to make sure we're still competitive, and if necessary, make adjustments to the scale. So as an example, this past December when we reviewed the market ranges, we noted we needed to do a 2% adjustment to make sure we did not lose competitiveness. So what that meant is we moved the scales by 2%, and then they got their step increase. So employees in the first 10 years and those thereafter in the even years, they got 2% range adjustment and a 2.5 step increase. So they ended up with a 4.5% increase in pay. Those that were in their odd years after year 10, so 11, 13, 15, 17, 19, et cetera, they got a 2% range adjustment. So again, the annual increase for the step would be 2.5%. Now, we're not giving it till January, so we won't need the full amount in this upcoming fiscal year, although it would be prudent to plan for that full amount because you do have to annualize it going into the next fiscal year. For our general workforce, they also had compression occur, and so we wanted to adjust that. We did that last year. It's a little bit different because it's not at all common to have step plans for general workforce. So what we did there, rather than creating that formal step system, we didn't feel we needed to have a 2.5% increase differential for every year of service. That would be rather expensive to do for the entire workforce. So what we did is we gave a general wage increase of 3% and then a 0.5% increase for each year of completed service up to 10%. And that did accomplish a feathering, if you will, of employees and created some movement so that we didn't have people bunched up together. For our upcoming year, I'm showing you what it would cost to do various different salary increases for what we call a general wage increase. A general wage increase is basically a cost of living across the board. I believe most of my peers are looking at a 3% increase, although I will say York County just came out with a 4% increase. They're the first locality in our region to release a budget. And I realize we're not York County, so I'm not saying we absolutely have to be at 4%. I'm just sharing information. But if more start to come out at 4%, that may put pressure on us to look at a higher amount. I certainly think our employees are deserving of 4%, again, going back to our manning levels. But a general cost of living would be in that 3%. Recognizing the extra work they do, 3.5 or 4 would certainly be, they're certainly worthy of that if you all would be supportive of that. But you can see what it would cost us to give that. And so as you think about how we afford that, and you look at what we talked about earlier with the real estate tax rate, we have to balance how much we do for employees and how much we do for our citizens. And we really should do something for both. We want to do tax relief and we want to support our hardworking employees. And this is the market adjustment information. We should probably move our general workforce ranges a little bit at a time so we don't have to do a big adjustment all at once. We would recommend doing no more than a 0.5% adjustment at one time. No more than 0.5% of half of what we do for the salary increase. I'm sorry, I wasn't clear there. If we do a 4% adjustment, for instance, we would recommend doing no more than 2, although you don't have to do a full half of what we do. If we did 3, it would be 1.5. If you did 2, it would be 1, but you could always do less than that. So if you would take a moment now and share your preferences with us, we would greatly appreciate that. Another thing we want to get your opinion on is health insurance. The city as an employer does provide an opportunity for employees to participate in our health insurance plan. Our costs are expected to increase by 4.5%. Traditionally, those increases had been shared between the city employees. However, during the lean years of the recession, we fully absorbed those because employees were not getting raises at all. And then as we started to climb out of the recession, they had very low raises, like 1%. And so the cost of the health insurance plans were growing pretty largely, and it would have eaten up the entire paycheck and even maybe more than the entire paycheck increase for particularly our lower wage employees. So we picked up 100%. Also, some of our competitors started to pick up 100% of the health insurance increases, and our school system has picked up 100% of the health insurance increase for their employees. So it's been very difficult to sort of wean ourselves away from doing 100%. This will show you what different options are and what it would cost our employees if we did these different scenarios, and it's showing you per pay period. So we offer employee only, and just, I'm not going to read all these charts to you, you can look at them, but an employee only on a weekly basis, if we shared it 80-20 with the employees, would cost our employee $3.04 per pay period. The next one is employee plus one minor. It would cost them $5.51 per pay period, or family coverage would be $11.90 per pay period. And then the historical split, you can see it varies between $688 and $26.93 per pay period, 50-50 between $803 and $31.42 per pay period. And if we were to pick up 100%, which is what we have been doing more recently and what many of our competitors do, of course it would not impact the employee at all. You can see here what it costs us under each of those scenarios, and you'll note that there isn't a substantial difference between any of these scenarios between what it would cost the city for picking it up in its entirety and splitting it 50-50. It's roughly $200,000. So with that information as a backdrop, please take a moment to poll on your health insurance preferences. Now we're going to move into the various federal grants that we receive. And I want to take a moment to explain why I'm asking you to poll your on the federal grants that we receive, and let us know your preferences with regard to these. You've likely seen news coming out of Washington that the Office of Management and Budget had issued directives that all federal grants be paused for evaluation. And then that directive was rescinded, and then the press secretary indicated that the memo that had been issued was rescinded, but the order to pause had not been. And of course, there's various motions before various courts that are considering whether or not the Trump administration can indeed pause and or rescind grants that had already been awarded. Hampton has received a lot of grants over time, some that are recurring grants that come every year to fund critical services, others that are more of a one-time nature. And right now, we are not receiving reimbursement on the overwhelming majority of our grants. Some have begun to trickle back in, and maybe all of them will ultimately trickle back in. That is certainly my hope and expectation. However, since we are polling with you, we wanted to see which of these grants you value most in the event that they do disappear, so that we know what your appetite is for continuing these services. Because, you know, at first glance, you would say, well, if the federal government doesn't support it, then let's not do it. But as you look through the following list, you may find some that are very critical to you, and you would say, no, we really have to pick this up. I know for myself, and knowing the criticality of some of the ones that you will see, as city manager, I really think they serve some very vulnerable people, and I would struggle with just getting rid of it altogether. Others, perhaps they really could go away. And we want to see what you think about these, and also make sure these are on your radar screen so that if we get to an unfortunate place where they do disappear, we're prepared to have that community conversation. So if you would look through the list that follows and let us know what your thoughts are about these. We're going to ask you in this round of polling to indicate whether these are Tier 1, Tier 2, or Tier 3 items for you. Now, Tier 1, think of it as a green light. These are really important, and you think these are so essential that they need to be preserved. Tier 2, think of it like a yellow light. These are important, but not the most important things. In other words, maybe they need to be done, but not this year. And tier 3, think of like a red light. These are not important at all to you. In other words, we can get rid of them or not do them at all. Now we're going to move on to the operating request. Now, I want to be clear about these. I have chosen to list every item that has been submitted to me as city manager. If they've come from all sorts of sources. They have come from our operating department heads. They have come from various advisory and stakeholder groups. Like you will see some that have come from the Parks and Rec Advisory Committee. You will see some that may have come from various neighborhood groups. You will see some that may have come from outside agencies. You will see one that came from the Riverside Hospital system. So they've come from all different kinds of places. And my general practice is not to take anything off of the list. So I apologize up front, it's a pretty long list. I want to be clear, there's no way, like no way we can fund all of these things. And there's no intention for me to fund all of these things. I only take things off the list, however, if we legally can't do them, or if the city council has indicated there's no way they would even entertain them, which is a pretty low threshold for coming off the list, which is why there's so many. So what we want to do is give you, the public, a chance to weigh in on them, just so we know what you think. So please don't infer that something that's on the list is something we automatically want to do. We just feel we have an obligation to surface everything that has come before us, or else we won't know what you think about them. So again, we're going to use the same tiered system ranking. Tier 1, green, you like it a lot, you'd like to see it done as quickly as possible. Again, realizing every tier green may not be able to advance all at one time, but it's the fact that you think it's really critically important. Tier 2, yellow, you like it a lot, but it's not your highest priority. For you, this is something that could come down the road. And tier 3, red, something you don't like, you don't think we need to do, you don't care if we never do it. Thank you. And last but not least, and I thank you for bearing with us because we have asked you to do quite a lot of preference ranking, we want to ask you what you think about our capital projects. Now remember, capital projects are those things that are one-time in nature. They're either going to be funded with end-of-the-year savings. That kind of money I told you happens because we can't perfectly gauge exactly where we're going to end at the end of the year. We're not going to overspend. We're not going to end up precisely on the dot. We're going to have some money left at the end of the year, and that money can go to fund community priorities that are one-time in nature. And the other way they can be funded is with bonds. And we will pay for that with debt service that's capped at our policy. Remember, I showed the 7.7% that we are at now, and I told you how we pay off some every year. So every year we can add, what we're paying off, we can put more out there and stay at a constant level. So we want to figure out what we're going to add over the next 5 years. So again, lots of different places have given us ideas for projects. Some have come from operating departments, some have come from business entities like the Coliseum Central bid or the Downtown Hampton Development Partnership, or neighborhood groups that have asked us to look at improvements to their neighborhood. Wherever they've come from, unless they were legally not possible or the council indicated no appetite for considering them, they are on the list. There's no way we can do them all. That's why we want to know what you think about them. Same process again, tier 1 green, you love the idea. Doesn't mean they'll all get done, but at least it tells us you think they're good ideas. Tier 2 yellow, you love the idea, you think it's a pretty good thing, but you also realize that it's something that could be done later down the road, maybe in years 6 through 10 as an example, instead of years 1 through 5. And lastly, tier 3 red, you don't want to see us ever do it, okay? So go ahead and rank or poll your preferences with tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3. All right, I promise you really at the end, just 2 last questions. We want to ask you your overriding philosophy about how to balance the budget. As you've probably discerned, it's going to be hard to balance the budget. Even if most of the projects and operating requests and federal grants you ranked at tier 2 or tier 3, there's still probably a fair number of greens. And with compensation requests and school budget sharing, it's hard to balance the budget and lower the tax rate. And we want to do some of all of these things, right? We want to lower the tax rate. We want to give our employees a raise. And there's probably some things we all want to do for public safety and our libraries and our other city services. So we need to have a philosophy about how we want to defer to balancing the budget. So we're going to give you 4 choices, and we would like you to pick the choice that best aligns with your personal philosophy. So the choices I'm giving you are as follows. Which of these are your highest, aligns best with your personal philosophy? To ensure that staff members receive competitive wages before considering other priorities. That would be federal grants, operating, capital, and lower tax rates. To achieve your other priorities first. Again, that would be the operating, capital, federal grants, or lowering the tax rate, and then address staff wages to a lesser degree. To achieve a few of those priorities, but also reduce the tax rate, or to achieve reducing the tax rate above all else. So if you'll let us know which of those is your highest priority, I would greatly appreciate it. Last but not least, we want to ask your opinion about the real estate tax rate you want. I realize we asked you this earlier, but it's possible your opinion has changed now that you've seen all the various competing priorities and potential projects that various departments and other people in our community have asked for. And if that's the case, we want to give you a chance to change your mind. If your mind hasn't changed, that's okay too. Let us know that. But just let us know, now knowing everything you know, how you would pick the tax rate if it was your call. And I want to quickly thank you for all the time you've invested. I know this is a long survey, but you've chosen to invest your time to learn more about your community, and hopefully you've enjoyed getting to know a little bit more. I can't tell you how much your input means to me. We have so many citizens and so many people with different ideas. The only way for me to make sure that we make a recommendation that reflects the views of our total community is to spend time like this with you, whether it's in person at our in-person meetings or online doing things like this. And I appreciate the opportunity to gather everyone's input. If you want to see what other people think, please feel free to tune in on March 26th at our 1 o'clock afternoon council meeting session, where we'll share all the results we see both in person and online. And if you can't tune in, because I know a lot of people work, we'll post all the results on our city website so you can see what other people in our community thought, because sometimes we hang out with people who think just like us and we assume everybody thinks the same way. But our community is a wonderfully diverse community with lots of different people from lots of different backgrounds, and it's kind of cool to see how we all come together and what different people think. So be sure to check out the total results online after March 26th. Again, thank you, and don't forget to hit that last question result.